welcome everyone. My name is Jamie Lougheed. I think I may know some of you or have been at conferences with a few, but I'm sure there's a lot of new faces listening in. A little background on myself. I am a high school teacher by vocation, also primary junior teacher for that matter. I'm in my 23rd or 24th year in education. I started my career at Upper Canada College, spent a significant stint at Crescent School before moving to Greenwood 16 years ago. I spent my first 10 years at Greenwood working in the admission sector, starting up our admission office for our new school. And about 6 years ago, I was asked by our principal if I'd be interested in starting up our advancement office with the goal of completing our first major campaign. So took on that challenge, having never raised a penny in my life. So that was an interesting leap of faith that I took in my life, but one that I certainly don't regret, and I've enjoyed the last 6 years very, very much. Couple opening pieces of advice I'd like to share is I think one of the keys to success and advancement is you cannot fear failure or rejection. I think we all know that you hear no many more times than you hear yes, and I would encourage anyone who's getting into this field that you have to not take what happens on a personal basis every day, leverage the relationships that we've all worked very hard to develop, and get to know your constituency groups very, very well. So that's how I would start. A little bit about Greenwood. For those who don't know, Greenwood is an independent high school located in Midtown Toronto. We founded ourselves back in 2002. We are grades 7 to 12. We have 475 students. We presently have 90 teachers and staff. We just recently completed, 2 years ago this past January, we completed a $30 million campaign, expanding our facility from 45,000 square feet to just over 100,000 square feet. If I was to identify what Greenwood's niche is it's our focus on personalized education and the belief that all students, no matter where they fall on the academic spectrum or scale, can be successful if given the right environment and tools to do so. A little bit about our shop. So today is really about talking about how small shops can do big things. We are a very lean machine at Greenwood. There's 4 people in our advancement department. I guess technically really 3 of us, or 2 and a quarter, though our communication manager comes in and out as needed. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But as you can see there, those are the 4 people. A little bit about today and what I hope you will get out of it. Some of the steps that you as an advancement office can take to organize a successful capital campaign, some strategies that you can use to manage what is necessary in small shops, a very large volunteer base, which we relied on heavily, and ultimately, what are some techniques to build a sustainable philanthropic culture that you can leverage post-campaign? Because I'm a big believer, if you're going to put all this time into this, you want something at the other end, even after you've raised the money, that will help to sustain your philanthropic culture in your institution. Ultimately, I understand that, a lot of what I say today, many of you may have heard before. I think if you come out of this in the next 45 minutes to an hour with 1 or 2 tidbits or tips that may work for you, hopefully I've done my job and you can walk away with something that you can put into action in your own school or institution. So some opening advice here. One of the many things I've learned since Greenwood's inception is that you often have to do a lot more with less. If you think you can, the bottom line is you will. And if you use your size and small office as an excuse, I can almost guarantee you that you won't be successful. Preparation is key. Have all your planning done well in advance before you press the go button on any campaign. You need to spend your time once the campaign launches raising money, not on organizing. Spend time needed to get to know your families during the planning phase if you don't already know them, because you're going to lean on them very heavily, not just for money, but also for your volunteer base. I'm going to get into the database a little bit later, but I'm a big believer that your database is critically important and needs to be managed properly. And my last sort of piece of advice before we get going is you need to be patient, and it's not a race to the finish line. It's a marathon, and know that going in. I learned the hard way that early on in our campaign that I was so eager to get out there and raise money that I would argue I left quite a bit of money on the table in the first few months that if I could turn back the clock and do it again, I would have done it differently. And I'll talk about that. A little bit of a poll here. I'd just be curious to help me gauge what I'm talking about, where people are joining us from today, whether you're from independent schools, post-secondary institution, polytechnic, CEGEP, et cetera. If you could just take a minute and you could fill that in, that would be helpful. Great. Does anyone, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in to Tara, and I can answer them. I'll stop again in a few minutes to do so. So it looks like the bulk of people here are coming from independent private schools, with about a third of you are coming from post-secondary universities or colleges, which is great. A little bit about the 5 stages I want to walk you through today, and to tell you a little bit about our campaign and what we did. So as I said, we expanded our campus from roughly 45,000 square feet to 105,000 square feet. We added a new learning commons. We added a second gymnasium, an expanded cafeteria, a rooftop terrace, performing arts theater with 150 retractable seats. We added some learning community rooms, which were essentially flexible teaching spaces, a new science wing, a media arts lab, and we've laid the groundwork for what's going to be a new innovation lab, which will be launching this summer. In addition, we set aside some money to also build the infrastructure for what we call the Greenwood Institute for Teaching and Learning, which is a professional development hub for our teachers with a lot of PD work being done in-house. I wanted to, go back a sec. I wanted to walk you through the sort of 5 different phases that we organized ourselves from, that being the planning and organizational phase, which I'll walk you through, our quiet phase and how we executed that, the public phase, the final push phase, and our stewardship. The length of our campaign roughly lasted 5 years. Planning and organizational took about 18 months. Our quiet phase took about a year, year and a half. Public phase lasted about a year and a half, 2 years. Final push was sort of built into that final year of the public phase. And then, our ongoing is the stewardship piece. Oh, sorry here. So planning and organization, sort of the key things I wanted to walk you through that we, in this phase, were our case and capacity study that we undertook, how we went about securing our lead donors, how we built our team, the communication materials and campaign look that we put into place, setting our goal. We didn't really have a goal until halfway through our planning phase of what we were actually, how much we were going to raise, and then building out our donor pipeline and how we did that and how critical that was to our success. So for many of you, you may use a different term for case and capacity study, but for us, this was an important part of what we did. So as far as a case and capacity study goes, as for a small shop like ourselves, to do something of that magnitude within our own in-house was just something we couldn't see ourselves doing. So we, on the advice of some of the people that I've worked with, we went to an outside consultancy group to conduct that case and capacity study for us. It cost us in the neighborhood of about $25,000 to $30,000. I would argue that was some of the best money we spent. If you think about it from a salaried position, we got a lot out of that document that we used throughout our campaign. And quite frankly, I just don't see how we would have done it ourselves. Instead of hiring additional full-time people, I leaned on this consultancy group quite a bit. I had them under a retainer where I met with our consultant on a monthly basis for 4 hours a week, one day, once a month. That person was excellent at keeping me focused on the prize, helping me plan out my next month's activities, making sure that when we hit roadblocks and snags that I had a way to navigate around that, and I found that to be incredibly helpful. Some organizations will hire temps at certain times, and that's beneficial as well. But I think often, your biggest overhead is salaries and compensation. And in a small organization, to believe that you can hire additional people through the campaign isn't always necessarily a reality. So what does the casing capacity do? It determines what's possible within your organization. It gives you something that you can analyze and test before putting it into action. And I think the other thing to mention, it's important that you update this casing capacity study on a yearly basis. So what did it ultimately give us? It gave us giving highlights from all of our donor base. It gave us background on everybody within our organization, every parent, every family. It uncovers considerable details on donor history and civic engagement. It helps put an initial number, in some cases, on your donors. That's something that you then can massage and validate over the course of the next year as you build out your pipeline. I would say the most important thing it did for me personally is it unlocked some big surprises amongst our donor families, that we had major donor families within our midst that we didn't even know existed. So that was something that the casing capacity study was very beneficial towards. I see a question here from Haley around project costs. That's a great question. There's of the $30 million, I would suggest that close to $5 million of that cost was things like consultancy groups, lawyer fees, permits, things of that nature, which are above and beyond construction costs. So our building was close to $20 million to build. Project costs were in the $5 million range, and then we set aside an additional $5 million, which was for this Greenwood Institute for Teaching and Learning. So hopefully that's helpful. So the next part of the the planning phase, which I wanted to address, was securing lead donors. To me, perhaps this is maybe one of the most important stages of the planning phase, because I believe without a lead donor, it's often very, very hard to get to the finish line. I could argue it's almost impossible to get to the starting line without a lead donor. And what is deemed a lead major donor to your organization may be very different than someone else. In our case, on a $30 million campaign, we were very fortunate to get two donors, each giving us $2.5 million for a total of $5 million that we secured in the lead up to the quiet phase of our campaign. And I think a really important part of that negotiation with those donors, which I'm going to speak to later on, is we negotiated with those donors the permission by which that we could go back to those donors at the end of our campaign with the hope that they may consider increasing their commitment to the campaign if we needed their support. And I'll come back to that later because that proved very, very important. Before we'd really started our silent phase, we already had close to 30% of our goal in-house. So that was $5 million in committed money, plus we had some surplus money that the school had saved. And in addition to that, we actually had some property that we sold, so we had some real estate revenue that came out of that. So we had close to $9 million, which was great. Next in the planning phase is around building your team structure, staffing, volunteers. And, I can't say enough about volunteers, but they can be your best friend and your worst nightmare at the same time, and how you manage them is going to be really important. As it pertains to volunteers, the people in your organization who like to help, and if they are being helpful, and that's key, get them on board early. Find a role that suits their skill and their skill set, and instantly your workload will start to diminish, I find. Make sure you have volunteers who represent all the key constituency groups. It's by nature you go to, in an independent high school, you go to your parents, but we went to our grandparents, we went to our board members, we went to our alumni, we went to our staff, we even went to our students to support us in that nature. Make sure you have real concrete work for them to do. Don't just make up work for them. If you don't have work for them, be honest and tell them. Also, I think it's important, give them permission to tell you that they're not comfortable doing what you're asking them to do. I constantly was asking my volunteers, are you okay with this? Do you feel comfortable doing this? Am I putting you outside your comfort zone? If so, let me find you something else. And I think that's important. They need to feel happy and engaged in the job that they're doing. How did we use our volunteers? Give you some examples. We had a campaign cabinet, which I'll get into shortly. We had annual giving class captains, which proved beneficial. I'll again talk about that in a bit. We had many families who hosted dinners and events at their homes. We had families or parents and volunteers coming in to do mailings for us, a lot of administrative work that we just didn't have the staffing to do, stuffing envelopes, putting up signage, baking food for dinners, or making food for dinners, etc. The last one there, which probably was at first overlooked but proved incredibly beneficial, was families donating their time and services. So we had a graphic designer family who we've worked with for many years who donated their services at a 50% cost. We had professional writers do a lot of our writing for our communication material. We had families who own high-end restaurants in the city that gave us their restaurant to host events, printers, etc. So that proved very beneficial. So the campaign cabinet itself, the campaign cabinet for us was really the group that helped us open doors. They helped us develop strategy. I wouldn't say our cabinet were very much involved in the cultivation and solicitation element of the campaign, but they were the sort of 10,000 feet people. Critical to any campaign is choosing a chair that is going to be dynamic, helpful, and connected. And one piece of advice that my consultant gave me, which was very valuable advice, is make sure that you as the EDA or the executive director or the head of your advancement team, you need to pick this person personally. Don't allow the board or the head of your institution pick this person. You need to be able to work with this person, and you know, in my case, I talk to our chair every single day. Sometimes more than that. I spoke to them on the weekend. He was on speed dial for me, and someone that I grew very, very close with and had a strong relationship with. This person needs to be an effective communicator, needs to be able to work very well with volunteers, needs to have tough skin, you know, key is keep that person in the loop. They should not be surprised about anything going on in the campaign at any time. So I see a message here about what is the role of the board versus the advancement office in the planning phase. Our board at our school, very much hands-off. I reported to our board probably twice a year and just gave them updates. Their big concern for us was the money coming in, quite frankly. That was once it went live. In the planning phase, they really had very little to do with it, other than they were consulted as part of the case and capacity study. So they were part of the test group in the case and capacity study around how much money we could ultimately raise. Ultimately, they were part of picking the realistic and attainable target, which I'm going to get to. So another little poll here. I'd be interested to know how many people do you have in your advancement office? If you could just answer that, that would be great. That's great. So I'm glad to hear I'm not alone. So the majority of you, over 60% of you, have a similar size office to what I was dealing with during my campaign. The irony is now, post-campaign, my office is even smaller now than what you see in this poll. So our model here that you see on the screen right now is what I worked with during our campaign. The principal, myself, our administrative assistant, communication manager, and advancement officer. Essentially, the role of each of those, our principal, if you're at a university, college, CEGEP, it might be a president or CEO. Really, that person is going to tell you what role they want to play. In our particular case, our principal was a strategizer, was a visionary person. he helped me with our cultivation and solicitation, but he very openly was not an asker. He didn't want to do that. He wasn't comfortable in that role and left that to me. Though he did attend most of the asks, he did a lot of the pre-chat, and then we had a secret sort of wink of the eye and turn it over to me, and I knew it was my turn to turn on the charm and see if we could get some money out of the ask. My role in the campaign was really around coordination, reporting, volunteer management, budgeting, communication. I was sort of overseeing everything on a daily basis. Our admin support was very, very limited. We have one admin assistant in our office that I had her use her time about a quarter of her week, a day and a quarter, maybe day and a half. The rest of the time she worked in our admission and recruitment office. So I had to manage her time very, very carefully, and she did a fantastic job, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but she mainly did all the database work for me. Our communication manager was in charge of being our single voice, and that's a really important piece, I think, to all of this. It's critical that there is one person, there's one voice or I shouldn't say one person, there's one consistent message getting out to your donors. You don't want mixed messages about how much you're raising, what the purpose of the campaign is for. There needs to be consistent messaging out there. Often you don't want volunteers saying one thing, staff saying another, advancement office saying a third, a donor saying a fourth. You'll get a lot of mixed messages, and that will confuse the campaign as a whole. So our communication officer, our manager, did an excellent job of managing that message for us. Haley, I'm going to get back to the students in a little bit, but that's a great question. Sorry, some of these are going a little quick. I'm just seeing a few questions come up here.
Jamie, one of them was around. Sorry, go ahead. Jamie, one of the questions was around, does the principal make any asks specifically?
Yeah, our principal, it's a great question. I had that very open conversation with our principal early on. My comfort level was high to do asking, and I said, listen, if you want to ask, you listen, it's your decision. And he said, I defer to you. Ultimately, we, as a team, the two of us were a good duo. I did all the asking. He just chose not to. There was 2 or 3 occasions where he had a very close relationship with the family where, he did ask, but generally speaking, he did not. Okay, I wasn't sure where to slide this slide in, but it just sort of randomly drops in here, but all around data reporting, gift entry. In small shops, my advice to you is have one person own that data, one person input that data. Make sure that you don't have multiple people doing gift entries and reporting and things like that, because I think it will get very confusing and there's a lot more room for error. Set the rules from the outset of who's in charge of what and what it is that you wanted to report on. What data do you want inputted? We use Razor's Edge in our case. So we sat down and mapped out a pretty, straightforward plan of what types of reports I was going to need on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. We built those reports ahead of time and made sure they were in the system. A couple tricks that worked for us is my admin support in this area did all of her gift entry on Friday afternoons. I did all of my acknowledging of gifts on Monday mornings, and that was something I tried to stick to very stringently. Next on the planning phase is building out your communication and material. I'm going to speed up a little bit on this just out of the interest of time, but we had a third-party firm do all of this work for us. Get it all done in advance. Do not spend time during your quiet and live phase creating communication material. It's very time-consuming, and it'll take away from what you need to be spending your time on. So some of the things that we produced were a case for support in advance, proposals, short and long proposals for when we were going to be going for asks. We had thank you cards made up. We had a naming catalog that was full of pictures of drawings of the spaces and how much those were going to be, what kind of money we were looking for to name those spaces. We had a fly-through video, animated fly-through video of our space. We had a campaign video testimonial of some of our lead donors. Chart of standards, which I put in all the campaign material, which showed us in order to get to the finish line how many of each types of gifts we would need. And I also had examples of what our donor walls would look like. What you see here is a picture on your left of your screen is a picture of what the building character building, that was the name of our campaign, what the campaign material looked like. That pink folder was an open bifold folder that we had to be able to slip lots of different things in. So I would put together different types of folders for different donors depending on what they wanted, with the Ask document, with our alumni magazine, with our Case for Support, annual giving brochure, annual report, lots of different things. You can see in the middle there's a little tiny pink piece of paper. That was a little cheat sheet that I had made up for all my volunteers. They could put in their wallet, they could put in their handbag, whatever they may be, keep by their phone, so that they were using the same language that I was using. And it was kind of like their little Bible of information, which proved very beneficial. The one on the right is our admission brochure, very similar in nature, but very dynamic, very colorful, but very consistent. So the next point on the planning phase, which I want to touch on, is setting realistic and attainable goals. Can't say enough about this. I think too often organizations set these very lofty goals, and they get three-quarters of the way through their campaign, and they're like, holy crap, how am I going to get to the finish line? I don't know why I thought I could raise this. There's no way I can. Make sure that whatever goal you're setting, it's a very realistic one. And whatever you set, I would undercut that number. It's better to exceed than to not get to where you want to get to. In our particular case, we used our case and capacity study as our guide, and we ended up raising almost to the exact dollar what our case and capacity study said we would raise. Take into account, to an earlier point, all the different funding sources, your actual campaign money, annual giving, budget surplus, whether you're selling real estate in our case, things like facility rentals. If you want to build that into your campaign, maybe that's part of your operating budget. It depends, I guess. Build it all in. Make sure it's all part of the goal. Some organizations like to count back. We did not in our case. Our campaign started with our 2 lead gifts, and anything prior to that did not count towards our campaign. And the last part of the planning phase is building out your donor pipeline. Many of you may have seen a document or a diagram similar to this. This was something that we used as our pipeline. It had 5 different levels to the pipeline, the identification phase right through to the committed phase. To talk a little bit about those phases, essentially to land yourself into the identification phase, that came through our case and capacity study. So anyone that the case and capacity study had identified as a potential donor landed in the identification sector of the pipeline. In some cases, there was numbers attached to those donors. In some cases, there were not. But one of the things we were able to do was fill in things like philanthropic history, civic engagement, all the stuff we got out of the case and capacity study. We sort of built into the identification phase. Then we slowly pulled some of those names, put a qualified number on them. We put a low ask number, we put a high ask number into the qualification stage, and that's where I started massaging and validating those numbers when I was cultivating these people. As we moved them into the cultivation stage, these were people that I was working with on a regular basis and trying to determine whether or not what I thought was going to be the right ask number was in fact the right number to be looking at. Once you get to the pre-solicitation stage, I would argue that you should know exactly what kind of range you're going in at. And secondly, the donor should know that you're coming, and the donor should know pretty much what he or she is going to be asked for. There should be no surprises. If you're going in at the pre-solicitation stage to have a meeting with a donor and you're asking for $1 million gift and they thought you were going to be asking for $50,000, something's wrong in the process. So make sure you have your ducks in order when it comes to that. What I produced here, and it's probably small on everyone's screen, and this I just made up. It's a fictitious chart for the sake of this presentation. But what I did is I showed you a little bit from a dollar figure how we determined when we were ready to go live with our campaign. So you'll see in each of these stages, there's a number of prospects within each stage. There's a low ask number, a high ask number. That's the total amount within each of those stages, and then a medium number. We found in our campaign that we hit 74% of our medium number. So in other words, we were hitting, there was essentially $5.3 million total in the medium ask amongst all of our prospects, and we were confident based on the history of our ask and that we would hit $3.8 million. And that's an important number, or important chart to identify, because it'll lead me to when do you know when to launch your campaign. And I'll get to that in a minute. But within each of those sections, we would have had all the names of all the donors, notes on when we met with them, next steps, and most importantly, we would have myself, our principal, or campaign chair would be assigned to every single donor, and then perhaps cabinet members in addition to that assigned to every member, so that we knew who was working on which file, okay? The quiet phase. So we finished the planning, we're ready to go. You've got everything you need in order. Now we're ready to press the go button. We're going to talk about known prospects. I want to talk about annual giving. I want to talk about building out your volunteer base, preparing for what will be your public launch, and continuing to build your pipeline. So, it's amazing. I found in our campaign we got off to a roaring start. We got a lot of very significant gifts very early. They were easy wins, as I like to call them. What I will say, though, is that you need to be careful that you do not leave money on the table. And if I learn one major thing is don't rush into the easy wins. Make sure you do your homework and spend some time cultivating these gifts, because you'll probably end up getting more than you bargained for or you anticipated at the beginning. And that was something I learned a couple stages into the campaign. Your easy wins are going to come from your cabinet members, your board members, your major historical donors, and those are the people you want to go to. What I found with the early stage ask is that I looked at the range that I'd set up for our donors. So if the range was $100,000 to $250,000 for a particular donor, I would always go in above my high ask number. So if $250,000 was the high, I would probably go in at around $300,000 and ask for that amount, knowing that I probably wouldn't get it, but ultimately I would land closer to my high range than to my medium or low range. It was funny, I found early in the first sort of 6 months to 12 months of our campaign that I was always pretty bang on with the number, and there wasn't a lot of back and forth on the amount, but there was a lot of negotiation around the term of the gift. Would they be able to give it over 3, 5, 10 years? And that's something I work closely with. Could they give stock? Could they use their family foundation, et cetera? Flow through shares, things of that nature. So there was a lot of negotiation on the how, not as much on the amount. And I found our average range was about 3 years, so that was good to work with. Again, with this group, make sure you plant the seed that at the end you're going to go back and potentially ask for more, and I'll come back to that later. Maintaining your annual giving campaign, again, a very important thing to do. I think often in campaigns your annual giving is the first thing that takes a major hit. We tried very hard to not make that happen, keeping in mind that about 90% of your donors with any organization are going to be annual donors, and they're not going to participate in your campaign. So one strategy that worked very, very well for me is knowing what our annual donors gave. I went out to many of them and said, listen, Mr. Jones, I understand that you give $1,500 a year to our organization. We're incredibly grateful for that. What I would ask you to do over the next 5 years is would you commit to a $7,500 gift over the next 5 years, $1,500 a year? And you get that in writing, and you can book that gift. And instead of counting on $1,500 a year, you've now for your campaign got $7,500. Many of those type arrangements make up a lot of money for your campaign, and that helped us tremendously. Building out your volunteer base once again. One of the neat events that we did was something called Dinners with Teachers, and my consultant gave me this idea, and I share it with you, and I think it would be something any organization should try. He got it from a hospital he worked with, and it was something called Dinner with Docs. So what we did was about 6 or 8 times, I can't remember the exact number throughout our campaign, We had a very nice dinner at one of our family's homes. They put on the dinner. They paid for the dinner, so there was no cost to us. We invited somewhere between 10 and 15 couples and probably 8 to 10 of our teachers. And it was an opportunity for our teachers to showcase themselves in front of the parents. Our parents love to hear what our teachers' background is all about. They love to hear what their plans are for the future, what they're working on with the kids in the classroom. Every one of those dinners that we did produced a six-figure gift for our campaign, a minimum of $100,000. We probably generated close to $1 million and $1.5 million alone through those dinners. So they proved very, very beneficial. As this quiet phase is going on, you're planning for your public phase. And you need to be thinking about how are you going to launch that campaign, what kind of party are you going to use to launch the campaign, how are you going to leverage your gift announcements, what kind of social media platform are you going to use, and I'm going to come back to that, but that's an important part of the quiet phase. And the last thing I would say is that donor pipeline that I mentioned earlier, you should be consistently and constantly updating that on a weekly basis, if not on a daily basis. That document was a live document that sat on my computer, hard copy in front of me. I was always adding to it on a daily basis. I was taking names off. If you know that there's someone on that list that's not going to develop into a donation, take them off the list. Don't waste your time looking at that name over and over again. You need to, especially in a small shop, you need to focus your energies on the must-wins. And you don't want to spend your time on names and families of people that you hope will turn into a gift when you know in your heart of hearts they're not going to, okay? So make sure you're updating that at all times. The public phase is obviously the most exciting and probably critically the most important phase of the campaign. And the number one question that many people ask is, when is the right time to launch? And I have a theory on that, and I'll get to you in a minute on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Paint the Town approach, which is something that we did, and how you leverage already secured gifts. And finally, I think my own secret sauce to this campaign was something I self-labeled campaigns within a campaign, and I'll get to that in a minute. When is the right time to launch? So as someone that was relatively new to advancement when I entered this role, I had read many articles, talked to many experts about, when do I launch publicly? How much money do I have to have in the bank before I launch? And I heard everything from 70% to once you put the shovel in the ground, you're not going to raise another penny. You got to have 50%. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I'll tell you what we did, and that was once our donor pipeline told me we were ready to launch. In other words, when my donor pipeline told me that 74% of my medium number was $30 million, then we were ready to launch. So I waited until my donor pipeline essentially gave me the heads up that we had enough people in our pipeline to ensure that we were going to hit that number. For us, that was 60% of $30 million, and that was roughly $17.5, $18 million raised. So that gives you an idea of what we did. But I think depending on the campaign, it could be very different for everyone else. We didn't even launch our public phase until months after the shovel was in the ground at our school. So people knew a building was coming, but they didn't know how much it cost. They didn't know what was going to be in that building. They just knew that there was a lot of construction and something exciting was happening. The public phase was an opportunity for us to talk more about it. The Paint the Town, I stole this from another institution, independent school in the city that I thought did a really good job. And that is, we had our students go home one day, Greenwood looking one way, coming back to school the next, and our whole campus had been transformed and campaign branded with signage. All of our hoarding out in front of our school was changed. Our email signatures had changed. Our letterhead had changed. Everything around the school had the look and feel of our building character building campaign. We did a quite extensive gift announcement. We introduced all of our volunteers, had bios on them. We launched our microsite on our website. It all happened in a 24-hour period. It was tons of excitement around it. Leveraging those gifts I mentioned, it's really important that you take advantage of the money that you've secured and tell the stories of your donors. When you're securing those gifts, once again, because we're small, you need the volunteers, the donors and the volunteers to help you disseminate the message of how you're doing in your campaign. So our families did an amazing job of letting us leverage their gifts. They didn't always allow us to say how much they gave, but they would often say, sure, you can use my family picture, here's my name, please don't use the amount. Or they might say, I don't even want my name associated, but you can say that we just had a new $100,000 gift given by a Greenwood family, whatever it might be. But the fact is it allowed us to keep talking about the success we were having, and it kept that needle moving, because ultimately you never want that needle to stop. Once it stops, people feel like you've hit a roadblock, and it'll be harder and harder to get money in. So that was that. The campaign within a campaign, as I said, was kind of our secret sauce. So I was starting with the help of my consultant saying, okay, we were hitting some roadblocks, we were hitting some snags, we were hitting some lulls in our campaign where we weren't getting as many gifts. And we had to come up with ways by which we could tap into very specific constituency groups. So in front of you here are a few examples of how we did that. So annual giving, we set very specific targets by grade that we wanted our annual giving grades to raise. I ran an alumni matching program, knowing that it wasn't going to yield a lot of money, but it was going to build a culture of giving amongst our alumni base. And how I did that was we had 3 families, past parents, donate $40,000 between them. What I asked them to do was use that money as a matching gift towards our alumni. Our alumni ultimately gave about $10,000. And what I challenged them, I said, for every dollar that you give, it'll be matched 3 times over. So if you give a $100 gift, it'll be like you gave a $400 gift. And we were able to raise $50,000 between the match and the alumni, and we named a space in the new building, the Alumni Lounge, and got their names on the board. What's amazing by that is 2 years since the campaign, a large proportion of our alumni are continuing to give, which means we got the itch of giving into their psyche, and now they are giving on an ongoing basis. The last story I want to tell you about these two, in the interest of time, because it was my most powerful moment in the campaign, and I learned a lot about leveraging the story, was around a grandparent challenge that was given to me. And my grandparents, I should add, were a huge part of my campaign that I didn't even count on in the planning phase. I hadn't even thought about it until I got going and realized I had a lot of large donors amongst our grandparents that weren't identified through the case and capacity study for obvious reason. But I realized that they had the capacity to help us considerably. So this one particular grandparent I went out for lunch with, and we had a wonderful lunch, and he cut me short. He was a pretty abrupt guy, and he said to me, Jamie, I have one challenge for you, and if you accomplish this challenge in the next 7 days, I will give you $1 million. And I just about dropped my lunch on my lap, and I said to him, well, what is that challenge? And he says, I will give you till a week today to make sure that 100% of your staff are giving to this campaign. I do not care about the amount. I just want 100% participation. So lunch ended. I ran back to school. I called an emergency staff meeting for 4 o'clock that afternoon, brought everyone into the staff meeting, and I said, I have a challenge for you all. This is the deal. We have someone who's willing to invest in your future from a professional development perspective, but he needs you all to participate in your own growth. You have 1 week to participate. Within 48 hours, I had every staff member and teacher signed on. I called the donor back, and I had $1 million check in my mailbox by the end of the week. It was a fantastic story in our campaign and really gave our campaign a boost when we needed it. So that's just an example of a campaign within a campaign. We're on to the final push phase of the campaign, and probably the hardest. It was almost a year and a half it took us to raise our last $2.5–3 million, and this is where I want to come back to that whole idea of leveraging your earlier gifts. It's very, very hard. You've asked so much of so many, and to go back out and try to find another $1 million or $2 million almost seems impossible. I went back to my original donors in the quiet phase. I said, I told you I was going to come knocking, and here I am. Would you be willing to up your commitment to this campaign with the eyes on getting the rest of the people who haven't given to give? And I was able to raise $1 million from my original donors through various amounts. And then I took that $1 million out to what I called the $1 Million Builders matching program. And for the last year of that campaign, any donor in the school that gave money, their dollar would be matched dollar for dollar. And that proved incredibly beneficial, and it got us across the finish line. So that takes us to this stewardship phase. So you finished all this hard work, and you essentially have finished your campaign. You've patted yourself on the back. You've celebrated this amazing project that's taken 5 years out of your life. Don't waste the opportunity and momentum that you've built. Make sure that you maintain the relationships with your donors. Make sure that your donors see firsthand how their generosity was put to work. Keep them up to speed on new developments within the school. How I do that and continue to do that, I consistently take our big donors out for lunches and dinners throughout the year, not asking them for a penny. I'm just keeping them up to speed. Donor reports, tours of facilities. One of the things I got a tip about a year ago from, which I think was a great piece of advice. If your donors are ever in the news, whether it be they've given a big donation to another institution, whether they got a new promotion at their job, whatever it might be, promote that within your own community if it's appropriate. Celebrate their generosity externally within your own community. They will be thankful and they appreciate it, and it keeps them engaged in your school. So as we come to conclusion, then I'm going to open it up to some questions. Some keys to the success in our campaign would be organized before pressing the go button. Spend the time. It's not a rush. Make sure you're organized, because if you're not, it's going to make the time that you are trying to raise money very difficult if you're backtracking, trying to get your ducks in order. Use your volunteers wisely. We had probably over 100 volunteers engaged in our campaign, all in differing levels of involvement, but you need to manage them, and you do not want to give them jobs that are going to make your job more difficult. Campaigns within a campaign. Try to create small goals within a larger campaign. Make it realistic for your donors. Allow them to participate in a meaningful way. They see $30 million as, well, my $1,000 is going to mean nothing to that $30 million, so why bother? If you give them a small project within that $1,000 now all of a sudden seems very meaningful. Setting realistic goals is important. This one is critical. Don't drag out your campaign. If you start hearing whispers around donor apathy, and I'm sick and tired of hearing about people asking me for money, it's time to wrap up your campaign. If you're hearing too much of that, you're damaging your post-campaign stewardship culture. So try to make sure you can finish with excitement versus with apathy, if that makes sense. And the last thing I would like to say is you're only as small as you think you are. Think big, and big things will happen. So with that said, I really appreciate you listening to me today. Hopefully you can take one or two things from what I've said and take them back to your schools and institutions and put them into play. Please contact me. There's my contact details. Call me at any time. That's my direct line. My email address is jamie.lougheed@greenwoodcollege.org. You can email me offline after this presentation. Happy to set up a call, tell you what works, what doesn't work. But does anyone have any questions? And I'm happy to answer them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. There were some questions that had come up that you didn't have a chance to get to. One of them regarding the student support for your campaign.
So student support, what I did during the campaign, it's a good question. We had every year our grads do leaving class gifts. So over the course of the 5 years of the campaign, each of the leaving classes developed a different project within the school. It could have been, providing the, equipment for the new gym or some of the giving money towards the tech and the media arts lab. It might not be a huge amount of money, but they were raising $2,000 and $3,000. But there wasn't a lot of, fundraising initiatives solely by the teacher or by the students. It was more parents, past parents, alumni, grandparents. Yeah.
Okay. There was one regarding the capacity study as well, and it was analytics of the database or traditional feasibility study, where you interview a subset of the community. So I guess that is just asking what you think, what the preference is there.
Sorry. Can you clarify what they're asking about the casing capacity study, like what the value of it was?
I think so.
Yeah, so I mean, the value, I mean, it cost, as I said, it probably cost us about $25,000 to $30,000 to conduct that study. And what it really gave us was some very hard data that would on, what each of our donors, their philanthropic history, their civic engagement, what their inclination was to give to Greenwood. So we did we tested that case and capacity study amongst some of our donor base after it had been done, and we knew that these were some of our potentially key donors. We went out and did some focus groups, third-party focus groups with our consultant to say, if Greenwood was to come to you, could you see yourself supporting this campaign? And would it be realistic if you gave this amount, because we feel this is a number that is in the ballpark of what you'd be willing to give. We got that feedback back, and that helped us develop the pipeline chart.
Perfect. There's a couple that have just come in. What's next after your campaign closes?
What's next? That's a million-dollar question, which I keep asking our board and our principal. We're in a bit of a transitional phase. Our principal is retiring at the end of this year, and we have a new principal starting in August. So the board is, for the last sort of year and a half, is kind of we're in a bit of no man's land right now. So my job has been to sort of maintain our annual giving campaign. I've been looking extensively at planned giving programs that we didn't have up and running prior to this campaign, looking to institute that, trying to build out our alumni engagement program. So that's where I've been spending my time. But, no doubt in the coming months, I suspect there will be another big project that will be landed at my doorstep to get ready on. Looking forward to it.
Jamie, did you do the prospect research yourself? Did you have volunteers? Was it the consultant or advancement staff who did it for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I relied pretty heavily on the case and capacity study for starters, and then I had my advancement officer do some research, as well as I used a third-party tool, not to plug anything, but I used iWave Pro is what I used to do a lot of my independent research on donors, and it proved to be very beneficial. But a lot of it, what I did with my consultant, and I had them on a retainer, is if we got to some very significant pitches, I would go back to my consultant and they'd do a deeper dive into some of those donors and help me get ready for those pitches.
Perfect. Yes, we can recirculate Jamie's email address. Apologies. We have that phone number up there, but we can circulate that email address for you guys to get in touch with him. Another question, Jamie, regarding the donors who committed the X amount of dollars for the campaign, do you count their commitment in the annual fund, or do you only count their participation in the annual fund numbers?
It's a great question. So how we did our reporting was annual report, what counted money in for that calendar year. We did not, we kind of kept our campaign pledges separate until after the campaign, and then we reported on them as a campaign, if that makes sense. Though we booked their pledge internally so that we knew that we were going towards the $30 million target. So within our microsite of the campaign, we had a running sort of thermometer that told the community at what level we were towards 30 million, but we weren't identifying, who had specifically given to that campaign. We identified dollar in the appropriate levels within the annual report for annual giving.
Great. A couple more as we close out the hour. What percentage of your community participated in your campaign, and any tips on best practices?
So we had about, if you include annual giving and major gifts, about 70% of our community, our parent community. So we have 475 students. I think there's 400 unique families within the school. So essentially 280, 290 of those families participated in the campaign. We had during the campaign 30% of our alumni, though keep in mind it's a very small number, participated in the, sorry, not 30%, I take that back. 10% of our alumni participated in the campaign. And we had roughly 6% of our past parents participated in the campaign.
Okay. There was a follow-up question to the one regarding the capacity study. It's just in regards to addressing the project cost actually being higher than the campaign cost. And what
project cost being higher than the project cost being higher than originally budgeted in the campaign cost?
Yeah, so what I have just done is Haley, who is the asker of that question, I've unmuted your line. So just to make sure I'm capturing this properly, do you want to clarify the question?
So can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
you can.
I can hear you.
Oh, great. So our team here is wondering what is done when your project cost for your campaign actually exceeds the campaign cost. How is it counted or addressed?
So in our case, need to mute it again. Tara, can you mute her line again?
I did.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Haley, but yes, we can hear you.
That's okay. There's back feedback. So I think, to my earlier point, Haley, I think what you need to do in the early phases, and to be honest, I wasn't overly involved in this phase, so I can't give you an exact number, but I could try to find out for you. Our board was much more involved in setting the actual number than I was. My job was to bring to the table to our board and to our principal what I thought we could technically raise. The cost of the project and the consultancy fees, lawyer fees and stuff, I wasn't necessarily privy to. I had an idea, but I didn't see the hard numbers on that. But what I do know that our principal told me is that they built in a pretty significant buffer zone there of close to 10%, somewhere in that neighborhood, for cost override, which we ended up eating up in the project. So, whatever that number is, I think they worked with the construction companies to say, okay, what's the realistic, work order overcharges that we could anticipate in this project, and built that into the target.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamie. That does bring us to 2 p.m. and the end of our webinar. I would like to thank our presenter, Jamie. Thank you for the time and the abundance of information that you've shared, as well as for being open to being contacted in case of I'd like to thank everybody as well for participating today. If you would like a copy of the recording, please be in touch. An email will be sent shortly regarding an evaluation, so you can go ahead and fill that out. And at the same time, any questions, you can respond to myself or Erica Lattimore for a copy of the recording. So again, thank you very much, Jamie, for being with us today, and for everybody for your participation.
Thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions.